What's up, Speedtards? Welcome to episode 20 of Futurism Forever podcast. Tonight we're going to be covering Andre Breton's Manifesto of Surrealism from 1924. So, yeah, it should be good. My panel tonight is CSD, James, and special guest Nicholas Dollinger. Nick Dollinger, this is his debut on Futurism Forever podcast. He invited me onto his podcast a couple months ago now, called The Beautiful Toilet. It's a really cool show. I'd highly recommend it. Before we get started, Nick, do you want to introduce yourself to our audience and talk about your podcast, your poetry, what people would find if they checked it out?
Sure, and thank you for your words of praise. I really appreciate it. And I guess yeah. So I do the beautiful toilet. It's kind of just like a revolving door of like things that I'm interested in. There's like a kind of like Orientalist current to it. Like Ezra Pound is like a big touchstone and topic of conversation. Perhaps a little bit too ubiquitous in recent episodes. But yeah, it's just like and it's like a solo enterprise. So I always have like different guests on. I'm pretty like into like radical openness and just like having like a big tent approach to that. And then I'm also like a poet and a creative writer, and I do journalism, but I guess I just try to maintain like a subtle distance between my professional and uh, creative life. But yeah, I also self-published a poetry book. I've been published in Expat Press and upcoming in the Red Virgin magazine. So
Okay, sounds good. His book of poetry is called Sunbathing I Want to, I believe. Did I get that
yes,
right?
yes, thank you.
Yeah, it's available on Amazon, so you can find it if you look for it. I'd recommend picking it up. I have not read it yet, to be honest, but I'm sure it's great. Nick's a great guy, so and his podcast is really good. So
Takes a great guy to know one.
anyway, without further ado, it's like a 50-page text. So let's start reading, and we'll break periodically throughout the text to talk about what we've read so far. So, yeah, the Manifesto of Surrealism by Andre Breton. So strong is the belief in life, in what is most fragile in life, real life, I mean, that in the end this belief is lost. Man, that inveterate dreamer, daily more discontent with his destiny, has trouble assessing the objects he has been led to use, objects that his nonchalance has brought his way, or that he has earned through his own efforts, almost always through his own efforts, for he has agreed to work. At least he has not refused to try his luck, or what he calls his luck. At this point, he feels extremely modest. He knows what women he has had, what silly affairs he has been involved in. He is unimpressed by his wealth or poverty. In this respect, he is still a newborn babe, and for the approval of his conscience, I confess that he does very nicely without it. If he still retains a certain lucidity, all he can do is turn back toward his childhood, which, however his guides and mentors may have botched it, still strikes him as somehow charming. There, the absence of any known restrictions allows him the perspective of several lives lived at once. This illusion becomes firmly rooted within him. Now he is only interested in the fleeting, the extreme facility of everything. Children set off each day without a worry in the world. Everything is near at hand. The worst material conditions are fine. The woods are white or black. One will never sleep. But it is true that he would not dare venture so far. It is not merely a question of distance. Threat is piled upon threat. One yields, abandons a portion of the terrain to be conquered. This imagination, which knows no bounds, is henceforth allowed to be exercised only in strict accordance with the laws of an arbitrary utility. It is incapable of assuming this inferior role for very long, and in the vicinity of the 20th year, generally prefers to abandon man to his lusterless fate, though he may later try to pull himself together upon occasion, having felt that he is losing by slow degrees all reason for living, incapable as he has become of being able to rise to some exceptional situation such as love. He will hardly succeed. This is because he henceforth belongs body and soul to an imperative practical necessity which demands his constant attention. None of his gestures will be expansive. none of his ideas generous or far reaching. In his mind's eye, events real or imagined will be seen only as they relate to a welter of similar events, events in which he has not participated, abortive events. What am I saying? He will judge them in relationship to one of these events whose consequences are more reassuring than the others. On no account will he view them as his salvation. Beloved imagination, what I most like in you is your unsparing quality. The mere word freedom is the only one that still excites me. I deem it capable of indefinitely sustaining the old human fanaticism. It doubtless satisfies my only legitimate aspiration. Among all the many misfortunes to which we are heir, it is only fair to admit that we are allowed the greatest degree of freedom of thought. It is up to us not to misuse it, to reduce the imagination to a state of slavery, even though it would mean the elimination of what is commonly called happiness, is to betray all sense of absolute justice within oneself. Imagination alone offers me some intimation of what can be, and this is enough to remove to some slight degree the terrible injunction, enough too to allow me to devote myself to it without fear of making a mistake, as though it were possible to make a bigger mistake. Where does it begin to turn bad? And where does the mind's stability cease? For the mind is the possibility of erring, not rather the contingency of good. There remains madness, the madness that one locks up, as it has aptly been described. That madness or another. We all know, in fact, that the insane owe their incarceration to a tiny number of legally reprehensible acts, and that were it not for these acts, their freedom, or what we see as their freedom, would not be threatened. I am willing to admit that they are, to some degree, victims of their imagination, and that it induces them not to pay attention to certain rules, outside of which the species feels threatened, which we are all supposed to know and respect. But their profound indifference to the way in which we judge them, and even to the various punishments meted out to them, allows us to suppose that they derive a great deal of comfort and consolation from their imaginations, that they enjoy their madness sufficiently to endure the thought that its validity does not extend beyond themselves. And indeed, hallucinations, illusions, etc., are not a source of trifling pleasure. The best controlled sensuality partakes of it, and I know that there are many evenings when I would gladly tame that pretty hand, which during the last pages obtains l'intelligence, indulges in some curious misdeeds. I could spend my whole life prying loose the secrets of the insane. These people are honest to a fault, and their naivety has no peer but my own. Christopher Columbus should have set out to discover America with a boatload of madmen, and note how this madness has taken shape and endured. So, does anyone have any thoughts so far? Talking about imagination and madness and all that.
I, I do. I think it's like important for any movement, whether it be artists, political, or not just movements, but business, to be like creative and have imagination, because that's what sets us. Our original ideas is what sets us apart from everyone else, and is what like drives society forward. Or has the potential to drive society forward.
Yeah, for sure. There's a lot more going on outside of the box. Like, don't be too rigid in your thinking and concerned with being proper. Like, creativity is a good thing. Being bold and daring and like it's something it shares in common with futurism. I think
Yeah.
surrealism.
Not gonna lie, I don't know if it's your voice, Geo, but every time you read this type of stuff that's somewhat poetic, I just immediately think of futurism now.
I guess like my voice is linked in your mindscape with avant-garde art. I don't know.
Morals.
I don't think my reading is that great, but someone has to do it. So um,
I think it's not that bad. But back on creativity, I think that's something that we lack nowadays because we even see this with like modern movies. Like it's just basically a remake with like different characters, whether it be like different actors or their races have changed or genders or etc. It lacks any originality, and we're just becoming a very unoriginal society. We kind of lost all of our creativity.
yeah, well, like movies especially, like they don't finance like new ideas. It's always reboots of old franchises and sequels and remakes and prequels. no one's doing anything new anymore in Hollywood. So like, I think it definitely does affect movies in particular. Though in this text, like Breton is talking mostly about literature. Um, yeah, I mean, there's no creativity in film anymore. I think that is very relevant to the discussion.
I
Um,
think it's like it's really difficult to even like conceive of like what it would mean to do something like vital and like original and like futuristic in the current milieu under like the like ideological and like aesthetic regimes of like contemporary life. Like I feel like that it's not so much like a deficiency of imagination, but there's almost like it's hard to even conceive of like something that would speak to this moment that feels both simultaneously like current and relevant, but also like has like the qualities of like art that that we admire from the past, while having like that aspect of novelty. It's like I don't know, I mean, I think that's kind of a part of like the point that people talk about with regard to like hauntology and like it's just like that kind of ossification of the culture that it almost feels like there's very little you can do that feels vital, and like kind of like unpacking that paradox is like the primary task, I think, of like artists of this generation.
yeah, for sure. Yeah, I'm not sure what the new art should or would look like, or what would be relevant. I just know we're in a state of like cultural gridlock, really. Like things aren't moving forward anymore, really. Um,
It's not only with just culture. We even see it like in our own spheres when it comes to like dissident politics. We just see a lot of people LARP as like the older movements of like 80 years ago, whether it be the original Italian fascist or the Soviets or you name it, monarchists, you name it.
yeah, it affects the political too. No one's coming forward with like fresh new ideas. Like the original fascists were a very new movement. They weren't trying to revive something from 100 years earlier. They took cues from the Risorgimento and all that, but they were trying to establish something new and different from everything that had come before it. Um, there's
Mhm.
nothing really on the horizon like that right now that I see.
Yeah, it's difficult to even conceive of it. Like you really have to like strain to like have a picture of what that would look like, even theoretically. And I guess I don't know. It's like a really like difficult like creative dilemma, I think.
Yeah. James, you were posting about like we need a new art movement earlier today. Do you want to read that post? Um,
I
by
was
any
I was
chance?
talking about that like a new art movement should encompass like the glorification of nationalism from futurism, the absurdity of Dada, and the power of the conscious mind from surrealism.
Yeah. James runs the Cabaret Voltaire channel on Telegram. It's like
It
more focused
it's
on Dadaism than surrealism or futurism, but we're all fans of all three. So
Yeah, it's a real good channel. I enjoyed a lot. I really enjoyed the post you just made about the situationist.
Oh yeah, thanks.
yeah. Anyway, we have a lot more to get through. So does anyone have final thoughts on that opening?
Another thing I wanted to draw attention to was his musings about like the criminals and like the mad how like they owe their incarceration to just like a few like moments of poor judgment, more or less. I think that's really interesting to conceive of, like just like how rare these like really consequential moments are in general. And I think that that's something that I think it alludes to something that I find really prevalent in like Mishima, that like just like the value of like those intense limit experiences, and how everything kind of like revolves around like these uh, incidences of glory or poor judgment. And yeah, I don't have much more to say beyond that.
You use the term limit experience. Is that like a reference to George Bataille?
Not in particular. No, I haven't read
Yeah.
Bataille.
Okay, I think he coined that term. It's about like how true ecstasy can only be found in the extremes of like sex and death. He wrote mostly about the taboo, right? But
Mhm.
Yeah, I think like that's where the term comes from. I just thought I'd ask about Bataille. The guy I interviewed earlier today is a big Bataille fan, and like we talked about him a little bit. So anyway, I guess I'll read the next part now. All right. It is not the fear of madness which will oblige us to leave the flag of imagination furled. The case against the realistic attitude demands to be examined, following the case against the materialistic attitude. The latter, more poetic in fact than the former, admittedly implies on the part of man a kind of monstrous pride, which admittedly is monstrous, but not a new and more complete decay. It should above all be viewed as a welcome reaction against certain ridiculous tendencies of spiritualism. Finally, it is not incompatible with a certain nobility of thought. By contrast, the realistic attitude, inspired by positivism from St. Thomas Aquinas to Anatole France, clearly seems to me to be hostile to any intellectual or moral advancement. I loathe it, for it is made up of mediocrity, hate, and dull conceit. It is this attitude which today gives birth to these ridiculous books, these insulting plays. It constantly feeds on and derives strength from the newspapers, and stultifies both science and art by assiduously flattering the lowest of tastes. Clarity bordering on stupidity, a dog's life. The activity of the best minds feels the effects of it. The law of the lowest common denominator finally prevails upon them as it does upon the others. An amusing result of this state of affairs, in literature, for example, is the generous supply of novels. Each person adds his personal little observation to the whole, as a cleansing antidote to all this. M. Paul Valery recently suggested that an anthology be compiled in which the largest possible number of opening passages from novels be offered. The resulting insanity, he predicted, would be a source of considerable edification. The most famous authors would be included. Such a thought reflects great credit on Paul Valery, who some time ago, speaking of novels, assured me that, so far as he was concerned, he would continue to refrain from writing. The Marquise went out of 5, but has he kept his word? If the purely informative style, of which the sentence just quoted is a prime example, is virtually the rule rather than the exception in the novel form, it is because, in all fairness, the author's ambition is severely circumscribed. The circumstantial, needlessly specific nature of each of their notations leads me to believe that they are perpetrating a joke at my expense. I am spared not even one of the character's slightest vacillations. Will he be fair-headed? What will his name be? Will we first meet him during the summer? So many questions resolved once and for all, as chance directs. The only discretionary power left me is to close the book, which I am careful to do somewhere in the vicinity of the first page. And the descriptions, there is nothing to which their vacuity can be compared. They are nothing but so many superimposed images taken from some stock catalog, which the author utilizes more and more whenever he chooses. He seizes the opportunity to slip me his postcards. He tries to make me agree with him about the cliches. The small room into which the young man was shown was covered with yellow wallpaper. There were geraniums in the windows, which were covered with muslin curtains. The setting sun cast a harsh light over the entire setting. There was nothing special about the room. The furniture of yellow wood was all very old. A sofa with the tall back turned down, an oval table opposite the sofa, a dressing table and a mirror set against the pier glass, some chairs along the walls, 2 or 3 etchings of no value portraying some German girls with birds in their hands. Such were the furnishings. I am in no mood to admit that the mind is interested in occupying itself with such matters, even fleetingly. It may be argued that this schoolboy description has its place, and that at the juncture of the book the author has his reasons for burdening me. Nevertheless, he is wasting his time, for I refuse to go into his room. Others' laziness or fatigue does not interest me. I have too unstable a notion of the continuity of life to equate or compare my moments of depression or weakness with my best moments. When one ceases to feel, I am of the opinion one should keep quiet, and I would like to understand, and I would like it understood that I am not accusing or condemning lack of originality as such. I am only saying that I do not take particular note of the empty moments of my life, that it may be unworthy for any man to crystallize, those which seem to him to be so. I shall, with your permission, ignore the description of that room, and many more like it. Not so fast there. I'm getting into the area of psychology, a subject about which I shall be careful not to joke. The author attacks a character, and this being settled upon, parades his hero to and fro across the world. No matter what happens, this hero, whose actions and reactions are admirably predictable, is compelled not to thwart or upset, and though he looks as though he is, the calculations of which he is the object. The currents of life can appear to lift him up, roll him over, cast him down. He will still belong to this ready-made human type. A simple game of chess which doesn't interest me in the least. Man, whoever he may be, being for me a mediocre opponent. What I cannot bear are those wretched discussions relative to such and such a move, since winning or losing is not in question, and if the game is not worth the candle, if objective reason does a frightful job, as indeed it does, of serving him who calls upon it, is it not fitting and proper to avoid all contact with these categories? Diversity is so vast that every different tone of voice, every step, cough, every wipe of the nose, every sneeze. If in a cluster of grapes there are no two alike, why do you want me to describe this grape by the other, by all the others? Why do you want me to make a palatable grape? Our brains are dulled by the incurable mania of wanting to make the unknown known, classifiable. The desire for analysis wins out over the sentiments. The result is statements of undue length, whose persuasive power is attributable solely to their strangeness, and which impress the reader only by the abstract quality of their vocabulary, which moreover is ill defined. If the general ideas that philosophy has thus far come up with as topics of discussion revealed by their very nature, their definitive incursion into a broader or more general area, I would be the first to greet the news with joy. But up till now it has been nothing but idle repartee, the flashes of wit and other niceties vying concealing from us the true thought in search of itself, instead of concentrating and obtaining successes. It seems to me that every act is its own justification, at least for the person who has been capable of committing it, that it is endowed with the radiant power, which the slightest gloss is certain to diminish. Because of this gloss, it even in a sense ceases to happen. It gains nothing to be thus distinguished. Stendhal's heroes are subject to the comments and appraisals which are more or less successful, made by that author, which add not one whit to their glory. Where we really find them again is at the point at which Stendhal has lost them. So I'll break there. This passage he's talking about how like in literature, there's all this emphasis on like describing the banal, like what he sees as the unimportant. It's not like noteworthy. Like the description of the room he quotes, which in the footnotes it says it was from Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. I guess in literature he'd rather focus on things that are exciting and not the banal. Any thoughts on that section?
I'm pretty sure we all enjoy the exciting sections of movies more than we do like the vanilla parts. But I think the vanilla parts have like they can like help build up to that, that the epic part of the story. Like it can have like little bits and pieces that are important that just slowly builds everything up.
Yeah, I would agree. Like it is kind of necessary to like describe what the room looks like. Especially like literature before like movies or photography existed. You really do want to like put the emphasis on detail. I mean, I think now people can kind of like imagine what a room looks like. They don't need it like spelled out for them. Um, is it like especially in film and stuff like you can see it. It's visual. It's there, right? But
Mhm. I think that he's like alluding to like a lack of like language economy. That like a lot of this description seems superfluous. I don't know. Personally, like I really my taste skew towards like the Baroque and like the elaborate, and so I like very like elaborate descriptions. However, I think that the mistake that a lot of writers make is like including descriptions which are totally superfluous to the point. And I don't know, like you would have to know the context really to judge the paragraph of like purple prose in its proper context. But there's like I feel like he's like alluding to like a lack of language economy and like a pointlessness to the passage. But
Yeah, it doesn't propel the plot forward at all. It doesn't reveal anything about the internal dialogue of the character. It's just kind of describing his surroundings and really, to Breton, a tedious, long-winded kind of way. It's
Mhm.
details that he's not particularly interested in, and it turns him off of like the book he's reading in general. Like he might like just shut the book there, he says, and like not make it any further as a
Mhm.
result of the long-windedness and the tediousness of this passage.
Well, I think that what he's saying here more or less has kind of become conventional wisdom in the century or so since he wrote it. It seems like the trend in like writing programs, or like, you know, even if you just like seek out like writing advice, books, internet, whatever, like the trend, like the popular style is like to make everything more minimalistic and Hemingway-esque. There's definitely like a backlash against like this kind of purple prose. I think that also like a part of that why it's like so prevalent in like the 19th century style is just like the economics of publishing. And like, to the best of my knowledge, I think a lot of these guys were they were paid by the page, and so that's why you have like a Les Miserables like being as long-winded as it is.
Yeah.
Kind of related back today when it comes to like TV shows. Like there's a lot of like episodes in like TV series that are just like filler that aren't really important to the plot, but they just have to do it so they can just get in so many slots filled in and to make money.
Yeah, they got to keep this series going forward, so characters will do things that don't make a whole lot of sense. You just to keep this series going. I prefer movies for that reason. Like, it tells like a more coherent plot in like 2 hours or so. There's like a beginning, a middle, and an end, and series just go on forever. It's a huge investment of time to like get started with the series. A lot of the time, I don't bother just because, unless I'm like really interested in it or I've heard things that are really good. Like I watched Breaking Bad, I like Sopranos. There are a few series I like, but in general, like, yeah, I'm not going to invest that kind of time
Mhm.
for a story that's long-winded and meandering and it kind of goes all over the place for the sake of keeping the series going. Like Walking Dead was like that, and I ended up giving up on it like after 2 seasons or something.
Yeah, it's the same with me when it came to The Walking Dead.
Yeah, I think it's a common decision that a lot of people made with that series, but
I think like the accelerated form of this, like the real like embodiment of it is like soap operas. And I know Jack from Perfume Nationalist is like a big proponent of soap operas as an art form precisely because of like that expansive like banality and like how things kind of like these like subplots or whatever kind of come and go, and it's almost like the stakes are severely ameliorated, but it's about like the kind of like largeness and like of the experience, and just like kind of creating like this aesthetic universe that you can inhabit. So that's not really my thing. I never got, I'm not aware of that, but I just think it's interesting that to my perception, like what attracts him to this and why he's become like such a vocal proponent of soap operas is exactly this quality, but like accelerated to a point of to a much greater extent than it would be with any of these like prestige TV shows.
Yeah. Yeah, because they all like the next at the end of every episode, it's like tune in next time to find out, and it just constantly keeps on going, and it keeps like the people who are actually interested in this just keep on watching it even after years. Like I have a Mimi that's been watching like this one soap opera that's been going on for 20 years, and she watches it almost every single day.
yeah, we all know people like that who are just really invested in this series. They can't miss an episode. I've never had that kind of attack. Well, I mean, I did with Sopranos when it was like new. I did with Breaking Bad, but yeah, I mean, it's hard to jump into a series because like you don't know what's going on. You really have to start it from the beginning and see it through to the end. Um, yeah, I don't really have anything to add to that. Um, any other final thoughts on this passage before we keep reading? I'll take that as a no. All right. Uh, okay. We are still living under the reign of logic. This, of course, is what I have been driving at. But in this day and age, logical methods are applicable only to solving problems of secondary interest. The absolute rationalism that is still in vogue allows us to consider only facts relating directly to our experience. Logical ends, on the contrary, escape us. It is pointless to add that experience itself has found itself increasingly circumscribed. It paces back and forth in a cage from which it is more and more difficult to make it emerge. It too leans for support on what is most immediately expedient, and it is protected by the sentinels of common sense. Under the pretense of civilization and progress, we have managed to banish from the mind everything that may rightly or wrongly be termed superstition or fancy. Forbidden is any kind of search for truth which is not in conformance with accepted practices. It was apparently by pure chance that a part of our mental world, which we pretended not to be concerned with any longer, and in my opinion by far the most important part, is being brought back to light. For this we must give thanks to the discoveries of Sigmund Freud. On the basis of these discoveries, a current of opinion is finally forming, by means of which the human explorer will be able to carry his investigations much further, authorized as he will henceforth be not to confine himself solely to the most summary realities. The imagination is perhaps on the point of reasserting itself, of reclaiming its rights. If the depths of our mind contain within it strange forces capable of augmenting those on the surface, or of waging a victorious battle against them, there is every reason to seize them. First to seize them, then if need be to submit them to the control of our reason. The analysts themselves have everything to gain by it, but it is worth noting that no means has been designated a priori for carrying out this undertaking, that until further notice it can be construed to be the province of poets as well as scholars, and that its success is not dependent upon the more or less capricious paths that will be followed. Freud very rightly brought his critical faculties to bear upon the dream. It is in fact inadmissible that this considerable portion of psychic activity, since at least from man's birth until his death, thought offers no solution of continuity, the sum of the moments of dream. From the point of view of time and taking into consideration only the time of pure dreaming, that is the dreams of sleep, is not inferior to the sum of the moments of reality, or to be more precisely limiting, the moments of waking, has still today been so grossly neglected. I have always been amazed at the way an ordinary observer lends so much more credence and attaches so much more importance to waking events than to those occurring in dreams. It is because man, when he ceases to sleep, is above all the plaything of his memory. And in its normal state, memory takes pleasure in weakly retracing for him the circumstances of the dream, in stripping it of any real importance, and in dismissing the only determinant from the point where he thinks he has left it a few hours before. This firm hope, this concern, he is under the impression of continuing something that is worthwhile. Thus the dream finds itself reduced to a mere parenthesis, as is the night. And like the night, dreams generally contribute little to furthering our understanding. This curious state of affairs seems to me to call for certain reflections. 1. Within the limit where they operate, or thought to operate, dreams give more evidence of being continuous and show signs of organization. Memory alone arrogates to itself the right to excerpt from dreams, to ignore the transitions, and to depict for us rather a series of dreams than the dream itself. By the same token, at any given moment we have only a distinct notion of realities, the coordination of which is a question of will. What is worth noting is that nothing allows us to presuppose a greater dissipation of the elements of which the dream is constituted. I am sorry to have to speak about it according to a formula which in principle excludes the dream. When will we have a sleeping logician, sleeping philosophers? I would like to sleep in order to surrender myself to the dreamers, the way I surrender myself to those who read me with eyes wide open, in order to stop imposing in this realm the conscious rhythm of my thought. Perhaps my dream last night follows that of the night before, and will be continued the next night with an exemplary strictness. It's quite possible, as the saying goes. And since it has not been proved in the slightest that in doing so, the reality with which I am kept busy continues to exist in the state of dream, that it does not sink back down into the immemorial, why should I not grant to dreams what I occasionally refuse reality? That is the value of certainty in itself, which in its own time is not open to my repudiation. Why should I not expect from the sign of the dream more than I expect from a degree of consciousness, which is daily more acute? Can't the dream also be used in solving the fundamental questions of life? Are these questions the same in one case as in the other? And in the dream, do these questions already exist? Is the dreaming any less restrictive or punitive than the rest? I am growing old, and more than that, reality to which I believe I subject myself, it is perhaps the dream, the difference with which I treat the dream, which makes me grow old. 2. Let me come back again to the waking state. I have no choice but to consider it a phenomenon of interference. Not only does the mind display in this state a strange tendency to lose its bearings, as evidenced by the slips and mistakes, the secret of which are just beginning to be revealed to us, but what is more, it does not appear that when the mind is functioning normally, it really responds to anything but the suggestions which come to it from the depths of that dark night to which I commend it. However conditioned it may be, its balance is relative. It scarcely dares express itself, and if it does, it confines itself to verifying that such and such an idea or such and such a woman has made an impression on it. What impression it would be hard pressed to say, by which it reveals the degree of its subjectivity and nothing more. This idea, this woman, disturb it. They tend to make it less severe. What they do is isolate the mind for a second from its solvent and spirit it to heaven as the beautiful precipitate it can be, that it is. When all else fails, it then calls upon chance, a divinity even more obscure than the others to whom it ascribes all its aberrations. Who can say to me that the angle by which the idea which affects it is offered, and what it likes in the eye of that woman is not precisely what links it to its dream, binds it to those fundamental facts which through its own fault it is lost? And if things were different, what might it be capable of? I would like to provide it with the key to this corridor. 3. The mind of the man who dreams is fully satisfied by what happens to him. The agonizing questions of possibility is no longer pertinent. Kill, fly faster, love to your heart's content. And if you should die, are you not certain of reawakening among the dead? Let yourself be carried along. Events will not tolerate your interference. You are nameless. The ease of everything is priceless. What reason, I ask? A reason so much vaster than the other, makes dreams seem so natural, and allows me to welcome unreservedly a welter of episodes so strange that they would confound me now as I write. And yet I can believe my eyes, my ears. This great day has arrived. This beast has spoken. If man's awaking is harder, if it breaks the spell too abruptly, it is because he has been led to make for himself too impoverished a notion of atonement. 4. From the moment when it is subjected to a methodical examination, when by means yet to be determined we succeed in recording the contents of dreams in their entirety, and that presupposes a discipline of memory spanning generations, but let us nonetheless begin by noting the most salient facts. When its graph will expand with unparalleled volume and regularity, we may hope that the mysteries which really are not will give way to the great mystery. I believe in the future resolution of these two states, dream and reality, which are seemingly so contradictory, into a kind of absolute reality, a surreality, if one may so speak. It is the quest of this surreality that I am going, certain not to find it, but too unmindful of my death, not to calculate to some slight degree the joys of its possession. A story is told according to which Saint Paul Roy, in times gone by, sorry for French pronunciation, used to have a notice posted on the door of his manor house in Camaret every evening before he went to sleep, which read, "The poet is working." A great deal more could be said, but in passing, I merely wanted to touch upon a subject, which in itself would require a very long and much more detailed discussion. I shall come back to it. At this juncture, my intention was merely to mark a point by noting the hate of the marvelous, which rages in certain men, this absurdity beneath which they try to bury it. Let us not mince words. The marvelous is always beautiful. Anything marvelous is beautiful. In fact, only the marvelous is beautiful. So in that section, he talked about Freud and the interpretation of dreams, which I find really interesting. Like without the work of Freud, surrealism probably could not exist because surrealism is all about like depicting dreamscapes and the surreal, and like kind of prying into the subconscious mind more so than like material reality. Do any of you guys have thoughts on that section and Breton's thoughts on Freud and dreams?
Um, this may be a little off topic, but I know that like throughout history, dreams have always played a major part in giving people ideas or like telling stories. I remember in the Bible, the book of Genesis, like one of the stories about was like one of Abraham's sons. I forget his name, but he was sold into slavery into Egypt, and he ended up having to interpret the dreams of the Egyptian pharaoh at the time, and like explain to him that there was going to be a famine that would happen in the years coming.
It was all revealed in a dream. Yeah. Um,
I think there's like something very particular to dreams, something that doesn't translate to waking life, and like so, and he recognizes this kind of like discontinuity. But like I always find, well, you probably know like the experience of like listening to someone talk about their crazy dream. It almost never works. It's almost never as interesting as it surely must have been, and so you have this like really intense like personal like experience of something, but it's almost like totally, because like the dream logic is so particular and salient. It's like it's almost impossible, I think, to like translate that into waking life in any like one-to-one correspondence, you know.
yeah.
Yeah. It's also because like I don't know if it's the same with you guys, but when I have dreams, I remember the dreams when I'm in the dream, but when I wake up, I just slowly start to lose like my memory of what happened, other than like bits and pieces here and there.
Mhm.
Yeah, I hardly ever remember my dreams, and like even when I do have like visual memories or like I remember bits and parts, like it's really hard to explain them or describe them. It's
Mhm.
something
I think
like
it's a
you feel more than like it's hard to rationally explain it. Like it's a feeling.
or
Yeah,
it's even
and
hard to like convey the feeling itself to anyone else.
Yeah,
yeah, and when you go back and have a dream again, don't you sometimes feel like you've seen this before, like deja vu?
yeah. Like think
Hmm.
like you'll people you know in real life will be characters in your dreams and stuff. It's usually not people who you've never interacted with before or like random people.
Hmm.
You know, you're taking cues from your waking life, and you know, it's just kind of your imagination running rampant and working on autopilot or something.
I think like surrealism encounters like a very similar issue to like psychedelic art, in that like it just like the particularity of the experience is almost like impossible to like faithfully reproduce in like in an artistic sense. And so I think like to a large degree, like the project that he's undertaking here, like the idea of like establishing like some continuity between like waking and like dreaming life, and I think it's impossible and like kind of quixotic, and that's where like surrealism kind of gets it inhabits that tension. And that it's like I think that surrealist art, like by and large, like it actually doesn't really like remind me personally of like a dream per se, because there's this very like self-aware like strangeness of it, whereas like in the dream state you never really like things are very bizarre, and yet you never really like feel that way. I think it's always so matter of fact, and like you have like an elevated like way, I guess, of like integrating like these very bizarre and unexpected and like nonsensical events, and like just kind of like narrativizing them as though they make sense.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up psychedelics actually, because I think it was Terence McKenna said something very similar to what Andre Breton said. Like he's talking about psychedelic drugs, and it's like when you like when you're experiencing an altered state, like you put a chemical in your brain that's like changing the way you're viewing things, but like McKenna argues that like that's just as legitimate as like sober material reality. And he compares it to like a dream state. Like when you're dreaming, like yeah, it's not physically real; it's all in your mind, but it's just as real to you in the moment. When I was reading this, like I'm not sure if you guys know what I'm talking about. I'm not even sure if it was Terence McKenna. I think it was, but I'm not sure if he was like if it was like a nod to the Surrealist Manifesto by Breton, but he has like expressed certain things in relation to like psychedelic drugs that I thought was interesting. Just like a parallel, I thought I'd highlight since it came
Um,
up.
I remember when I read Ride the Tiger by Evola, like he talked about something similar with LSD, like getting into the spiritual world and all that. It's kind of interesting. I like and how like one can like use this to be useful, and how others can abuse this and destroy and like misuse this power. I hope I'm making some sense out of this, and I'm not just saying random shit.
Yeah, Ernst Junger also experimented with like LSD and mescaline, so there are a few people in like the radical right who were involved in that world in varying capacities. What was Evela's take on LSD again? 'Cause I don't remember.
It's kind of
It's
more of
been
a
a few
mixed
years
bag.
since I read it.
It's more of a mixed bag. He says it
Yeah,
can be used to good and get like connected into the spiritual world and all that, but at the same time, it can really fuck with your brain.
yeah. Um, I seem to recall him presenting LSD as like for its spiritual value, like using it as a vehicle for spirituality is misguided. Um, and it doesn't really work like as well. It's like a shortcut. You're trying to fast track instead of doing it in a more organic, natural kind of way. Um, if I recall correctly, it's been a few years since I read Ride the Tiger, but
It's also been like several months since I've read it too, so I may be misremembering this stuff too.
Yeah,
yeah,
I'm in the same boat. I read it like a few years ago, but I vaguely remember him being like kind of hostile to like psychedelics, but his exact reasoning was it went a little bit over my head.
yeah. Um, I think he thinks it's like I said, like a shortcut, or you're trying to fast track instead of doing it in a more disciplined, um, sober state of mind. Like you can experience those same spiritual plateaus or whatever, but yeah, you can reach it faster with drugs, but like you can't like go as high, or you don't experience it in the same way. It's
I know he said you had to have some discipline when it comes to like the spiritual world and all that. I can say that much.
yeah, and patience. You know, but yeah, I think his opinion on psychedelics for spiritual reasons was kind of he was critical of it. Um, I have not gotten into what Ernst Junger actually wrote about LSD. I just know he experimented with it, and he was friends with like what's his name, Timothy Leary, I think, or Albert Hoffman, the guy who invented LSD. Um,
It was Timothy Leary, if I'm not mistaken.
yeah, which is cool. Just like a little side note, tidbit of information. Um, but yeah, should I continue reading, or does anyone have final
Yes,
thoughts
go
on
ahead.
dreams or Freud? Or all right then. In the realm of literature, only the marvelous is capable of fecundating works which belong to an inferior category, such as the novel, and generally speaking, anything that involves storytelling. Lewis's The Monk is an admirable proof of this. It is infused throughout with the presence of the marvelous. Long before the author has freed his main characters from all temporal constraints, one feels them ready to act with an unprecedented pride. This passion for eternity, with which they are constantly stirred, lends an unforgettable intensity to their torments and to mine. I mean that this book, from beginning to end, and in the purest way imaginable, exercises an exalting effect only upon that part of the mind which aspires to leave the earth, and that stripped of an insignificant part of its plot, which belongs to the period in which it was written, it constitutes a paragon of precision and innocent grandeur. It seems to me none better has been done, and that the character of Matilda, in particular, is the most moving creation that one can credit to this figurative fashion in literature. She is less a character than a continual temptation. And if a character is not a temptation, what is he? An extreme temptation, she. In The Monk, the nothing is impossible for him who dares try, gives it its full convincing measure. Ghosts play a logical role in the book, since the critical mind does not seize them in order to dispute them. Ambrosio's punishment is likewise treated in a legitimate manner, since it is finally accepted by the critical faculty of a natural denouement. It may seem arbitrary on my part when discussing the marvelous to choose this model, from which both the Nordic literatures and Oriental literatures have borrowed time and time again, not to mention the religious literature of every century. This is because most of the examples which these literatures could have furnished me with are tainted by puerility, for the simple reason that they are addressed to children. At an early age, children are weaned on the marvelous, and later on they fail to retain a sufficient virginity of mind to thoroughly enjoy fairy tales. No matter how charming they may be, a grown man would think he were reverting to childhood by nourishing himself on fairy tales, and I am the first to admit that all such tales are not suitable for him. The fabric of adorable improbabilities must be made a trifle more subtle the older we grow, and we are still at the stage of waiting for this kind of spider. But the faculties do not change radically. Fear, the attraction of the unusual, chance, the taste for things extravagant are all devices which we can always call upon without fear of deception. There are fairy tales to be written for adults, fairy tales still almost blue. The marvelous is not the same in every period of history. It partakes in some obscure way of a sort of general revelation, only the fragments of which come down to us. They are the romantic ruins, the modern mannequin, or any other symbol capable of affecting the human sensibility for a period of time. In these areas which make us smile, there is still portrayed the incurable human restlessness, and this is why I take them into consideration, and why I judge them inseparable from certain productions of genius, which are more than the others painfully afflicted by them. They are Villon's gibbets, Racine's Greeks, Baudelaire's couches. They coincide with an eclipse of the taste I am made to endure. Ayu's notion of taste is the image of a big spot. Amid the bad taste of my time, I strive to go further than anyone else. It would have been I, and I lived in 1820. I, the bleeding nun. I would, I who would not have spared this cunning and banal. Let us conceal, whereof the parodical Puissant speaks. It would have been I. I would have reveled in the enormous metaphors, as he says, all phases of the silver disc. For today I think of a castle, half of which is not necessarily in ruins. This castle belongs to me. I picture it in a rustic setting, not far from Paris. The outbuildings are too numerous to mention, and as for the interior, it has been frightfully restored in such a manner as to leave nothing to be desired from the viewpoint of comfort. Automobiles are parked before the door, concealed by the shade of the trees. A few of my friends are living here as permanent guests. There is Louis Aragnon leaving. He only has time enough to say hello. Felipe Supol gets up with the stars, and Paul Elward, our great Elward, has not yet come home. There are Robert Desnos and Roger Vitrick out of the grounds poring over an ancient edict on dueling. George Auric Jean Paulhan, Max Maurice, who rose so well, and Benjamin Perret, busy with his equations with birds, and Joseph Deltail, and Jean Carré, and Georges Limbour, and Georges Limbour. There is a whole hedge of George Limbours. And Marcel Knoll, where is T. Frankel, waving to us from his captive balloon. Georges Malkin, Antonin Artaud, Francis Gerard, Pierre Naville, J. A. Beaufort, and after them Jacques Baron and his brother, handsome and cordial, and so many others besides, and gorgeous women, I might add. Nothing is too good for these young men. Their wishes are, as to wealth, so many commands. Francis Picabia comes to pay us a call, and last week, in the Hall of Mirrors, we receive a certain Marcel Duchamp, whom we had not hitherto known. Picasso goes hunting in the neighborhood. The spirit of demoralization has elected domicile in the castle, and it is with it we have to deal every time. It is a question in contact with our fellow men. But the doors are always open, and one does not begin by thanking everyone, you know. Moreover, the solitude is vast. We don't often run into one another. And anyway, isn't what matters that we be the masters of ourselves, the masters of women, and of love too? I shall be proved guilty of poetic dishonesty. Everyone will go parading about saying that I live on the Rue Fontaine, and that he will have none of the water that flows therefrom. To be sure, but is he certain that this castle, into which I cordially invite him, is an image? What if this castle really existed? My guests are there to prove it does. Their whim is the luminous road that leads to it. We really live by our fantasies when we give free rein to them. And how could what one might do bother the other? They're safely sheltered from the sentimental pursuit and at the trysting place of opportunities. So I guess I'll break there. Does anyone have thoughts on that section? I like how he starts it out. Like he's talking about Lewis's The Monk, a book I'm not familiar with, but he's talking about how like kids or children are more like tuned into what he's talking about. You know, they're more open to their imaginations, to the dream worlds. They accept it as reality. Um, Whereas as you grow up more, like, you know, you kind of lose your ability to really appreciate like fantasy or things like fairy tales, or, you know, you just kind of become dismissive of these kinds of things as infantile or juvenile or silly. But to Breton, I think he thinks it's like extremely important to be open to these kind of things. So what do you guys think?
Yeah, I can actually relate to that. Like I'm mostly like a nonfiction reader. Like I mostly read books about history, politics, and like occasionally theology, and that's been like my main subject since I was like in ninth grade. And I don't really dabble in fiction too often. It's most of the times I just find it boring, especially when it comes to books.
Growing up, I was mostly into reading fiction. Like I was interested in politics and anarchism in particular, but most of my reading time was spent on like fiction and literature. It's only like when I got into fascism that I started getting more into history and theory and stuff like that. So like I was already in my late 20s. But growing up, I was mostly interested in literature. That was most of my reading.
Hmm. I predominantly read prose fiction, I would say. I read novels, and I hope that if I read enough novels, I will turn into a novelist. But
Yeah, I mostly read nonfiction.
Yeah. So I think that section kind of speaks for itself. I don't have much to add to it.
Also, with a lot of this entire text, it seems like a lot of it has to do with like liberation of like the mind and the individual and things of that nature. It's very in line with a lot of left-wing thoughts and ideas. Am I wrong
Yeah.
in saying?
No, no, I think it did have a profound influence on like the left. Andre Breton himself was like an ardent communist, so Marxist. I think he became like an anarchist later in life. But but he butted heads with certain figures of surrealism who were a little more right-leaning, like Salvador Dali was like a supporter of Franco, and he was he kind of warmed up to Catholicism later in life, and yeah, Breton didn't like that. He butted heads with Salvador Dali a lot over his politics and his religious views. I think he kicked him out of the Surrealist movement at one time. He did that to a lot of people. Like Georges Bataille also got like kicked out of the Surrealist movement. So did Antonin Artaud, who he did mention in that section. Um, so yeah, he kind of ran the movement like it was literally 1984 or something. Sounds familiar, but
Yeah, he got
This is
into a
literally
bit.
1984.
yeah.
I think
James,
it also appears to just like have like this very like Promethean persuasion that you don't really see that a lot, I think, in like contemporary like Marxist or anarchist um, movements for the most part.
yeah, I think it has been lost, but like the Situationist International, which maybe James can comment on a little bit. I think they were directly inspired, and the group The Black Mask, like they name drop surrealists and Dadaists, even futurists, quite a bit as like a major influence for what they were about. Um, James, do you see parallels between what we've read so far and like the Situationists?
I'm still haven't read that much on the situations yet to comment.
Okay, all right. Sorry for putting you on the
Mm.
spot. Like the idea of from Raoul Vanagam's The Revolution of Everyday Life, like, you know, just liberating every aspect of your life. It's not merely economics, it's not merely political. Like, we need a completely new lifestyle to liberate ourselves from the doldrums of late capitalism or whatever. It's kind of like um, I'm truncating it and, you know, condensing it, but it's kind of the general idea behind situationism, which I do think owes a heavy cue to surrealism. But
It also takes influence from Dadaism.
yeah, the Dadaists mostly like due to the horrors they experienced in World War One, kind of embraced absurdity and like it was kind of like a nihilistic rejection of reality. They just made fun of shit and like popular morality or things like that. They wanted
And
to like deconstruct reality and society, and yeah, they poked fun at shit. Like they were kind of trolls a little bit,
and,
like
and many of them,
like Marcel Duchamp's toilet or whatever, the urinal thing. James knows what I'm talking about.
yeah, and many of them later became surrealists as well.
Yeah. Why did so many of them become surrealists? Do you want to comment on that?
Because there was basically that there was basically knowledge that the spirit of Dada was dead, so they was basically trying to find something else.
Yeah, it was a very short-lived movement. And a lot of them went on to embrace surrealism later on. I kind of see Dada as an important precursor to surrealism. Like a lot of stylistic qualities carried over, but the intent and the subtext was very different. Um, like yeah, it has more to do with like dreamscapes and the uh, the uh, the dream world, stuff like that, than like a nihilistic rejection of contemporary society or morality or things like that. Um, but yeah, I don't think you could have had surrealism if the Dada movement hadn't existed for a couple years. Um, I'm like only a couple years after it got started, they were proclaiming it dead. It kind of reminds me of like the punk movement in that way. Like, you know, the Sex Pistols come out and like a couple months later that same year, Crass are saying like punk is dead and it's sold out and it's lost its original meaning already. Now, like 50 years later, people still listen to it. Did it really die? I don't know. But yeah, it was definitely short lived. And, you know, it's really hard to maintain like that early spirit for an extended period of time. It's fleeting and it can only exist for a short while.
Yeah, data
And
really only existed during the First World War.
yeah,
I kind of
eventually it
find it
will
odd
lose its
how
authenticity.
I,
Sorry, go
I
ahead.
do I do find it interesting how a lot of these like progressive art movements also attract, or a lot of their members end up becoming like traditionalists, like Julius Evola. Like he
Yeah,
was a futurist
he
at
was a
first, and he
yeah, he was a Dadaist for a few
Uh,
years in his youth. He was
who
also into like Max Stirner and individualist anarchism for a while. I think it was reading
who
Nietzsche that got him out of all that and got him
uh,
started on traditionalism.
I think a big part of the Julius Evola lore as well is that he was like painting his fingernails and carousing around with like a woman like about like 30 years older than him. And I don't know how that ended or what kind of context that brings, but I feel like that was instrumental in his biography and his turn to traditionalism in one way or another.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, Hugo Ball, one of the founders of Dada, later embraced Roman Catholicism.
yeah, as did Salvador Dali. Even Marinetti later in life became a Catholic. And there's like religious futurist paintings later on in the second wave of the movement during fascism in power. It's debatable, like whether things would have evolved that way on their own or whether it was like political compromise, like they wanted to get along with the church and Catholic Italians.
I think it was more like compromise, because everything that like we read about futurism so far is about rejecting the past and the older moral systems. And Catholicism is a really old moral system and religious set.
Yeah. I mean, in the new ethical religion of speed, he talks about establishing a new religion. But it should be noted that like we haven't gotten into later futurism at all on the channel yet. Like World War One is just kind of starting. We're like we've mostly been focusing on the build up to World War One, and Electric War was like when the war was first starting. We haven't really gone past World War One yet. We haven't even gotten to like fascism yet as far as our Dada readings go. So like it's still pre-fascism, mostly pre-World War One. Well, like next year we'll probably get into the later period, the second wave of futurism. Um, anyway, we're going pretty far off topic. Should I keep reading, or does anyone have any final thoughts they want to share before I start up again? I will
You,
take that.
you.
Go ahead. All right. Man proposes and disposes. He and he alone can determine whether he is completely master of himself, that is, whether he maintains the body of his desires, daily more formidable in a state of anarchy. Poetry teaches him to. It bears within itself the perfect compensation for the miseries we endure. It can also be an organizer, if ever as the result of a less intimate disappointment. We contemplate taking it seriously. The time is coming when it decrees the end of money, and by itself will break the bread of heaven for the earth. There will still be gatherings on the public squares, and movements you never dared hope participate in. Farewell to absurd choices, the dreams of dark abyss, rivalries, the prolonged patience, the flight of the seasons, the artificial order of ideas, the ramp of danger. Time for everything. May you only take the trouble to practice poetry. Is it not incumbent upon us, who are already living off it, to try and impose what we hold to be our case for further inquiry? It matters not whether there is a certain disproportion between this defense and the illustration that will follow it. It was a question of going back to the sources of poetic imagination, and what is more, of remaining there. Not that I pretend to have done so. It requires a great deal of fortitude to try to set up one's abode in these distant regions where everything seems at first to be so awkward and difficult. All the more so if one wants to try to take someone there. Besides, one is never sure of really being there. If one is going to all that trouble, one might just as well stop off somewhere else. Be that as it may, the fact is that the way to these regions is clearly marked, and that to attain the true goal is now merely a matter of the traveler's ability to endure. We are all more or less aware of the road traveled. I was careful to relate, in the course of a study of the case of Robert Desnos entitled Entre des Mediums, that I had been led to concentrate my attention on the more or less partial sentences, which, when one is quite alone and on the verge of falling asleep, become perceptible for the mind without it being possible to discover what provoked them. I had then just attempted the poetic adventure with the minimum of risks. That is, my aspiration were the same as they are today, but I trusted in the slowness of formulation to keep me from useless contacts of which I completely disapproved. This attitude involved a modesty of thought, certain vestiges of which I still retain. At the end of my life, I shall doubtless manage to speak with great effort the way people speak, to apologize for my voice and my few remaining gestures. The virtue of the spoken word, and the written word all the more so, seemed to me to derive from the faculty of foreshortening in a striking manner the exposition, since there was exposition, of a small number of facts, poetic or other, of which I made myself the substance. I had come to the conclusion that Rimbaud has not proceeded any differently. I was coming with a concern for variety that deserved better. The final poems of Mont-de-Piet. That is, I managed to extract from the blank lines of this book an incredible advantage. These lines were the closed eye of the operations of thought, that I believe I was obliged to keep hidden from the reader. It was not deceit on my part, but my love of shocking the reader. I had the illusion of a possible complicity, which I had more and more difficulty giving up. I had begun to cherish words excessively for the space they allow around them, for their tangencies with countless other words that I did not utter. The poem Black Forest derives precisely from this state of mind. It took me 6 months to write it, and you may take my word for it that I did not rest a single day. But this stemmed from the opinion I had of myself in those days, which was high. Please don't judge me too harshly. I enjoyed these stupid confessions. At that point, Cubist pseudo-poetry was trying to get a foothold, but it had emerged defenseless from Picasso's brain, and I was thought to be as dull as dishwater, and still am. I had a sneaking suspicion, moreover, that from the viewpoint of poetry, I was off on the wrong road, but I hedged my bet as best I could, defying lyricism with salvos of definitions and formulas. The Dada phenomena were waiting on the wings, ready to come on stage, and pretending to search for an application of poetry to advertising. I went so far as to claim that the world would end, not with a good book, but with a beautiful advertisement for heaven or for hell. In those days, a man at least as boring as I, Pierre Reverdy, was writing. The image is a pure creation of the mind. It cannot be born from a comparison, from a juxtaposition of two or more or less distant realities. The more the relationship between the two juxtaposed realities is distant and true, the stronger the image will be, the greater its emotional power and poetic reality. These words, however sibylline for the uninitiated, were extremely revealing, and I pondered them for a long time, but the image eluded me. Reverdy's aesthetic, a completely a posteriori aesthetic, led me to mistake the effects for the causes. It was in the midst of all this that I renounced irrevocably my point of view. So yeah, let's break there for a bit. What to talk about in that section? So like, he kind of rejects Cubist pseudo poetry in favor for where he's going with it. The Dada phenomenon, we're waiting in the wings, ready to come on stage. So he talks about the Dadaists in this section, kind of like acting as like a precursor between Cubism and Surrealism. I don't know. Again, I think like this section kind of speaks for itself. I don't have anything to add, but maybe someone else on the panel does. Any thoughts, guys? Or should I keep reading?
Keep reading.
All right. One evening, therefore, before I fell asleep, I perceived so clearly articulated that it was impossible to change a word. but nonetheless removed from the sound of any voice, a rather strange phrase which came to me without any apparent relationship to the events in which my consciousness agrees. I was then involved, a phrase which seemed to me insistent, a phrase, if I may be so bold, which was knocking at the window. I took cursory note of it and prepared to move on when its organic character caught my attention. Actually, this phrase astonished me. Unfortunately, I cannot remember it exactly, but it was something like, "There is a man cut in two by the window." But there could be no question of ambiguity, accompanied as it was by the faint visual image of a man walking cut halfway up by a window perpendicular to the axis of his body. Beyond the slightest shadow of a doubt, what I saw was the simple reconstruction in space of a man leaning out a window, with the window having shifted with the man. I realized that I was dealing with an image of a fairly rare sort, and all I could think of was to incorporate it into my material for poetic construction. No sooner had I granted it this capacity than it was in fact succeeded by a whole series of phrases, with only brief pauses between them, which surprised me only slightly less and left me with the impression of their being so gratuitous that the control I had then exercised upon myself seemed to me illusory, and all I could think of was putting an end to the interminable quarrel raging within me. Completely occupied as I still was with Freud at that time, and familiar as I was with his methods of examination, which I had some slight occasion to use on some patients during the war, I resolved to obtain for myself what we were trying to obtain from them, namely a monologue spoken as rapidly as possible without any intervention on the part of the critical faculties, a monologue consequently unencumbered by the slightest inhibition, and which was as closely as possible akin to spoken thought. It had seemed to me, and still does, the way in which the phrase about the man cut in two had come to me is an indication of it, that the speed of thought is no greater than the speed of speech, and that thought does not necessarily defy language, nor even the fast-moving pen. It was in this frame of mind that Felipe Suppolt, to whom I had confided these initial conclusions, and I decided to blacken some paper with a praiseworthy disdain for what might result from a literary point of view. The ease of execution did the rest. By the end of the first day, we were able to read to ourselves some 50 or so pages obtained in this manner, and begin to compare our results. All in all, Suppolt's pages and mine proved to be remarkably similar. The same over-construction, shortcomings of a similar nature, but also on both our parts, the illusion of an extraordinary verve, a great deal of emotion, a considerable choice of images of a quality such that we would not have been capable of preparing a single one in longhand, a very special picturesque quality, and here and there a strong comical effect. The only difference between our two texts seemed to me to derive essentially from our respective tempers, Suppold's being less static than mine. And if he does not mind my offering this one slight criticism, from the fact that he had made the error of putting a few words by way of titles at the top of certain pages, I suppose in a spirit of mystification. On the other hand, I must give credit where credit is due, and say that he constantly and vigorously opposed any effort to retouch or correct, however slightly, any passage of this kind which seemed to me unfortunate. In this he was, to be sure, absolutely right. It is in fact difficult to appreciate fairly the various elements present. One may even go so far as to say that it is impossible to appreciate them at a first reading. To you who write, these elements are, on the surface, as strange as they are to anyone else, and naturally you are weary of them. Poetically speaking, what strikes you about them above all is their extreme degree of immediate absurdity. The quality of this absurdity, upon closer scrutiny, being to give way to everything admissible, everything legitimate in the world, the disclosure of a certain number of properties, and of facts no less objective, in the final analysis than the others. I kind of want to break there before I keep reading because it's kind of getting into a new thought in the next section. But does anyone have anything they want to talk about from that stretch? I'm going to take that as a no, so I should keep reading.
Yeah, keep going.
All right. He talks about Guillaume Apollinaire in this next section, and we are going to be reading Futurist Anti-Tradition in a couple months by Guillaume Apollinaire. It was one of the winners of our recent poll, so he did write about futurism. I just thought I'd mention that before I start reading this section.
Oh, that's
In,
cool.
yeah, in homage to Guillaume Apollinaire, who had just died and who on several occasions seemed to us to have followed a discipline of this kind, without, however, having sacrificed to it any mediocre literary means. Suppolt and I baptized the new mode of pure expression, which we had at our disposal, and which we wished to pass on to our friends, by the name of Surrealism. I believe that there is no point today in dwelling any further on this word, and that the meaning we gave it initially has generally prevailed over its Apollinarian sense. To be even fairer, we could probably have taken over the word supernaturalism employed by Gerard de Nerval in his dedication to the Fi de Fou. It appears, in fact, that Nerval possessed to a T the spirit with which we claim a kinship. Apollinaire having possessed, on the contrary, not by the letters, still imperfect, of surrealism, having shown himself powerless to give a valid theoretical idea of it. Here are two passages by Nerval which seem to me to be extremely significant in this respect. I am going to explain to you, my dear Dumas, the phenomenon of which you have spoken a short while ago. There are, as you know, certain storytellers who cannot invent without identifying with the characters their imagination has dreamt up. You may recall how convincingly our old friend Nodier used to tell how it had been his misfortune during the Revolution to be guillotined. One became so completely convinced of what he was saying that one began to wonder how he had managed to have his head glued back on. And since you have been indiscreet enough to quote one of the sonnets composed in this supernaturalistic dream state, as the Germans would call it, you will have to hear them all. You will find them at the end of this volume. They are hardly any more obscure than Hegel's Metaphysics or Swedenborg's Memorabilia, and would lose their charm if they were explained. If such were possible, at least admit the worth of the expression. Those who might dispute our right to employ the term surrealism, in the very special sense that we understand it, are being extremely dishonest. For there can be no doubt that this word had no currency before we came along. Therefore, I am defining it once and for all. Surrealism, psychic automatism in its pure state, by which one proposes to express, verbally, by means of the written word, or in any other manner, the actual functioning of thought, dictated by thought in the absence of any controlled exercise by reason, exempt from any aesthetic or moral concern. Encyclopedia, philosophy. Surrealism is based on the belief in the superior reality of certain forms of previously neglected associations, in the omnipotence of dreams, in the disinterested play of thought. It tends to ruin, once and for all other psychic mechanisms, and to substitute itself for them in solving all the principal problems of life. The following have performed acts of absolute surrealism. Messrs. Aragon, Baron, Boffard, Breton, Carive, Crevel, Deltail, Desnos, Elward, Girard, Limbourg, Malkin, Maurice, Naville, Knoll, Perret, Picon, Suppolt, and Vitric. They seem to be, to the present time, the only ones, and there would be no ambiguity about it were it not for the case of Isidore Ducasse, about whom I lack information. And of course, if one is to judge them only superficially by their results, a good number of poets could pass for surrealists, beginning with Dante, and in his finer moments, Shakespeare. In the course of the various attempts I have made to reduce what is, by breach of trust, called genius, I have found nothing which in the final analysis can be attributed to any other method than this. Young's Knights are surrealist from one end to the other. Unfortunately, it is a priest who is speaking. A bad priest, no doubt, but a priest nonetheless. Swift is surrealist in malice. Sade is surrealist in sadism. Chateaubriand is surrealist in exoticism. Constant is surrealist in politics. Hugo is surrealist when he isn't stupid. Debord Valmore is surrealist in love. Bertrand is surrealist in the past. Rabelais is surrealist in death. Poe is surrealist in adventure. Baudelaire is surrealist in morality. Rimbaud is surrealist in the way he lived and elsewhere. Mallarme is surrealist when he is confiding. Jerry is surrealist in absence. Nouveau is surrealist in the kiss. Saint Paul Bois is surrealist in his use of symbols. Fargue is surrealist in the atmosphere. Vacher is surrealist in me. Reverdy is surrealist at home. St. Jean Perse is surrealist at a distance. Roussel is surrealist as a storyteller, etc. I would like to stress this point. They are not always surrealists, and that I discern in each of them a certain number of preconceived ideas to which, very naively, they hold. They hold to them because they had not heard the surrealist voice, the one that continues to preach on the eve of death and above the storms, because they did not want to serve simply to orchestrate the marvelous score. They were instruments too full of pride, and this is why they have not always produced a harmonious sound. But we, who have made no effort whatsoever to filter who in our works have made ourselves into simple receptacles of so many echoes, modest recording instruments who are not mesmerized by the drawings we are making, perhaps we serve an even nobler cause. Thus do we render with integrity the talent which has been lent to us. We might as well speak to the talent of this platinum ruler, this mirror, this door, and of the sky, if you like. We do not have any talent. Ask Philippe Soupal. Anatomical products of manufacture in low-income dwellings will destroy the tallest cities. Ask Roger Vitrick. No sooner had I called forth the marble admiral than he turned on his heel like a horse which rears at the sight of the North Star and showed me, in the plane of his two-pointed cocked hat, a region where I was to spend my life. Ask Paul Elwood. This is an oft-told tale that I tell, a famous poem that I reread. I am leaning against a wall with my verdant ears and my lips burned to the crisp. Ask Max Maurice, the bear of the caves and his friends, the bittern, the vol of one, and his valet, the wind, the Lord Chancellor with his lady, the scarecrow for sparrows, and his accomplice the sparrow, the test tube and his daughters, the needle, this carnivore and his brother, the carnival, the sweeper and his monocle, the Mississippi and its little dog, the coral and its jug of milk, the miracle and its good Lord, might just as well go and disappear from the surface of the sea. Ask Joseph Deltail. Alas, I believe in the virtue of birds, and a feather is all it takes to make me die laughing. Ask Louis Aragon. During a short break in the party, as the players were gathering around a bowl of flaming punch, I asked the tree if it still had its red ribbon. And ask me, who was unable to keep myself from writing the serpentine, distracting lines of the preface. Ask Robert Desnos. Sorry, one sec. Ask Robert Desnos, he who more than any of us has perhaps got closest to the surrealist truth. He who, in his still unpublished works, and in the course of the numerous experiments he has been a party to, has fully justified the hope I placed in surrealism, and leads me to believe that a great deal more will still come of it. Desnos speaks surrealist at will. His extraordinary agility in orally following his thought is worth as much to us as any number of splendid speeches which are lost, Desnos having better things to do than record them. He reads himself like an open book, and does nothing to retain the pages, which fly away in the windy wake of his life. So I'm gonna stop there. This is the section where he actually defines surrealism. So I expect there will be things to talk about here. So I'm gonna read it again just so it's fresh. But he defines surrealism as psychic automatism in its pure state, by which one proposes to express, verbally by means of the written word or in any other manner, the actual functioning of thought, dictated by thought in the absence of any control exercised by reason, exempt from any aesthetic or moral concern. So thoughts on that definition of surrealism?
It reminds me a lot of idealism
Mm-hmm.
in some ways.
That's
think
what
it
I was thinking too.
I think it brings
Go
a
ahead.
lot of clarity to his the whole essay here, the whole manifesto, in that I mean, a lot of the time it seems like he's doing this exaltation of like intuition over kind of like analytic reasoning and like these kind of like more processed methods for creating art. And I think that that actually makes a lot of sense, and that's why he is so particularly invested in like dreams, is because that's where like the dialogue almost like your inner dialogue almost stops and it becomes purely like intuition speaking and like rendering worlds ex nihilo.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I'm also going to read his definition of encyclopedia or philosophy because it's related to surrealism. Surrealism is based on the belief in the superior reality of certain forms of previously neglected associations, in the omnipotence of dreams, in the disinterested play of thought. It tends to ruin once and for all other psychic mechanisms, and to substitute itself for them in solving all the principal problems of life. The following have performed acts of absolute surrealism. He goes on to name a bunch of figures we would describe as surrealist. And he says Dante was a surrealist. He says Shakespeare at times was surrealist. Swift, Sod, he names a bunch of people who are kind of have overlap with surrealism, though like it didn't exist at that time, so they couldn't have embraced it in full. There are clear nods or like hints that like things would be heading in this direction throughout like the history of literature, really. The people he mentions cover a lot of ground, are very diverse in style. Um, did anyone have thoughts on some of the people he mentioned? Like Sod is a surrealist and sadism. Poe is a
I love
surrealist
this
and
list.
Yeah, the
Yeah,
list is
Yes,
pretty
it's a
funny.
very diverse list.
And I think it does kind of tie in with like that aspect that like the surreality is like this this force of like pure intuition, and it makes sense how that intuition can manifest in like these established writers, many of whom I would think that Breton would be very hostile to in terms of their like attested values.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah. I find it interesting how like they have like certain like how the writer sees them having certain like surrealist like ideas and concepts to them. It kind of reminds me of like the book, The Conservative Mind. I know it's like not something y'all like to read, but it like he kind of like went back to all these thinkers that had certain like conservative ideas and thoughts to them, even though they had some other contradictory thoughts that we wouldn't consider conservative at all.
yeah. I have not read The Conservative Mind, so I can't really comment on it. But sure, I mean, yeah, I mean, there are like any kind of movement, whether it be artistic or political, there are precursors who come before, and it would be impossible for like the movement in question to manifest itself if people hadn't done this or that prior to it. Like nothing just pops up out of nowhere. There are precursors to it. And Mussolini said something like that about fascism. I'm not going to botch the quote by trying to run off memory, but I think some of the listeners will know what I'm talking about. Everyone owes their debt to those who came before them. It's not like a very futurist thing to say because Marinetti wouldn't like that, but I do think there is truth to it. Yeah, you see.
We have to understand the past to understand who we are. That's just a reality. We can't live without the past.
I think we can focus way too much on idealized pasts, and it hinders our ability to create great futures or like move forward in a confident manner.
But there is also like I think a lot of like great like artists who are very like futuristic like minded nonetheless like view themselves in some kind of continuity with the past, and so still like maintain the understanding that like that it is crucial to like understand the past if only to see like the kind of like dialectical progression of artistic history.
Yeah, you can do bold new things and still owe influences to those who came before you. And we reject our symbolist masters. I think I brought this up on the last podcast too. Like Marinetti does mention some of his influences, and like Emily Zola is one of them, and Walt Whitman of all people is another one. None of us really got the Walt Whitman reference or what Marinetti took from Walt Whitman, but that is someone who he did cite as an important influence of futurism. So like he did take inspiration from those who came before him too. But yeah, he was mostly against like just idolizing like these old figures.
Yeah,
And,
nostalgia, basically. Like,
yeah,
just a glorified version of the past. Like,
yeah, being obsessed with your past. I mean, look at Italy, look at Rome. Like, there's ruins everywhere, museums, and like it's all great. It's aesthetic and all that, but if you want to make like a great 20th century Italy that surpasses the greatness of ancient Rome, like these constant reminders of your past are not really conducive to doing that. So like Marinetti would drain the canals of Venice and replace them with like roadways and like modern technology. And against Passeus Venice, he talks about that.
you know, like how I look at it is like, yes, you should look at the past. Oh, like, let me try to rephrase this. The past, like, yes, look at Rome and how great it was, but think of what we can do now. That just shows us that if we can do that back then we can do something better now.
Yeah, a lot of it is poetic flourish too. Like he's trying to inspire greatness in the here and now, and so he kind of makes these like over the top statements. But anyway, back to surrealism. I think that's a good place to wrap up this podcast. Actually, like he kind of gets into other things and talks about like literature after this, but as like an intro to surrealism, I think that's pretty much the gist. Where he like defines it, the important precursors. Um, Unless you guys object, you want me to keep reading, but I think we have provided a good intro to surrealism for the audience.
Yeah, I have nothing else to say.
Yeah,
There's one point that occurred to me as we were reaching the end of this that I wanted to quiz you guys about. So one thing that I just remembered from my conversation with Curtis Yarvin was that he said that there are certain like types of literature, like certain genres, that make it very easy for like mediocre writing to kind of like uh, present itself unexceptionally, and like to really like it make it easy to not flat out embarrass yourself, but to still to be very mediocre. And he actually said that surrealism in poetry is like more or less like can function this way. And he says magical realism in prose fiction and surrealism in poetry, that these kind of like allow mediocre writing to like disguise itself. And I don't know if I necessarily agree with that or not. I just thought that was interesting, like as a model.
Yeah, I don't know if I agree with that either, but yeah, it's a very interesting way of looking at it.
I listened to that interview, and when he said that, like it reminded me of Tristan Zara's idea of like you take like this is how you should write a Dada poem. Like you take a newspaper article, you cut out all the words, put them in like a plastic bag, shake them up, and then your poem is the order in which the words come out. And it's like I did think of like you're not actually writing anything. It's entirely up to chance.
It's like an
It is,
exercise in indeterminacy, like in
yeah,
the musical sense.
yeah. I think James wrote a poem that way. Like, how did that go, James?
Yeah, I didn't much care for it.
Yeah, the results are too up to chance, and it's not like an artist honing his craft or something.
It
But yeah,
makes some
that's
sense
what
though,
else I
because
had to
it's
look
like as a process, it's like well, it kind of allows like this natural intuition, I guess, to like manifest itself. And so if there's something really inspired there, it's almost like the universe itself has authored like beautiful like juxtaposition of like these words that you've put in the bag.
Yeah, it reminded me of like William Burroughs' cut up technique, I think it's called, in which he did something very similar. And Marinetti has like words and freedom, which is just kind of like random words with like none of the other elements of writing present. It's just like random words that are kind of like loosely. He feels like it got the point across just as well without all the fat. It's more direct that way, but it's not easy reading, and it's not like immediately apparent of like what he's getting at. I think it's too open to interpretation to communicate concisely that way, even if it is poetry.
Yeah, it's like it will never really like rise above the level of being like a mere formal experiment.
Yeah, it's just all style, no substance, in my opinion.
Or maybe the opposite. It's all substance, and that it is all purely like about like the process and like the form and like the means of acquiring it, and but like there's no like kind of like, or like the individual poet's like vision is kind of muted by the
Yeah,
process.
I do have an example of Marinetti's Words and Freedom. Like I did the reading, a response to objections. Towards the end, it's like 2 pages of random words. So if you want, like I felt ridiculous reading it, but I did get through it. It's on the YouTube channel.
You know, Dada
People
has a
can
similar
listen.
concept to the sound poem.
Yeah. Do you want to elaborate a bit?
It was kind of similar to Marinet's Words and Freedom.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, yeah, there were a few ideas going around in the 20th century that were kind of like this, and it does kind of lend itself to go back to what Curtis Yarvin was saying, like just people who are really not good poets being able to hide behind like this style and like present themselves as like really profound, creative, original poets or writers, but it's just a practice in style. And I don't know, there is definitely some concern with
I think what surrealism does, like done well, what it really draws upon is like that intuition and like that spark of like something that it is beyond yourself that you can just like try to like tap into. But like that's like a very difficult and like process. And so I guess there's like this arbitrariness to like to bad surrealism. I also think just one more point on the whole the process of like the Dada process of like shaking the bowl of words and then composing a poem off of that. I realized that this is like an attempt to write poetry by entropy, but like right, because like the way of the world, it's so much harder to like create something like positive and like meaningful and like endowed with like actual value, and like when you have like everything's like slated for collapse, everything is like time limited and likely to dissipate, and like there's always like that analogy of like how much of the universe had to happen to create like um plate. Say you're holding like a ceramic plate in your hands, and how little do you have to do to just turn it into like random crap, like dispersed energy. And so it's very unlikely that you would like arrive at something as good as like a deliberately like considered product by such a method, because it's just like allowing the force of entropy to kind of have its way with the words.
Yeah, it's a good point. Um, I don't have anything to add right now. Um, I think that's a good point to wrap up. Thanks for coming on, Nick. Thanks for
Thank you
coming
for
on,
having me. This was great.
Tuesday and James. Yeah, I had fun, and I think we made a good intro to surrealism. So we'll be back in 2 weeks. We're going to be covering The Charm of Egypt by F.T. Marinetti, which was recently translated by Lance Lepollon. And we should be having him on to talk about the book with us. So I'm looking forward to that one. But until then, thanks for listening, and see you guys again soon. Salute.
All right. See you soon. Bye.